Well, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for staying for those of you who were here earlier. We're commemorating two Burheath men today. They didn't know each other. They were in Burheath at different times and sort of passed, their families passed like ships in the night. The first of those two men to be born in Burheath was Edward Beadle. He was born in 1884 and the family lived in Canons Farm cottages. They still stand today. They're the only houses north of Canons Lane between the Brighton Road and Canons Farm. And his father worked on the farm as a farm servant and as a cowman. He was only in the village until he was about 7 years old, before the family moved away, first to Kenley and then to Croydon. When he grew up, he became a brickmaker. His brother was a bricklayer and presumably they worked together. And then he became a foreman at the Borough Council stores in Croydon. He married, had a young daughter, and had a daughter in 1908, Lily, and we shall leave them there for a moment. The second of the two men we're commemorating is Thomas Riches. The Riches family came to Burheath at about the time that Edward Beadle was leaving in the early 1890s. They already had several children by that point. Thomas's mother was a barmaid at the Alma Tavern in Wandsworth. You can still see it today. It still stands if you're passing through Wandsworth Station, just on your left as you're sort of heading out of London. And lodging at the pub was his father, William Riches, a carpenter and joiner by trade. And the two of them got together and they went on to have several children, first in London and then down in Epsom. The Riches family had a connection with the owners of a coaching inn, the Red Lion, which used to stand on the Brighton Road. Burheath was famous for two coaching inns, with the Tangier and the Red Lion. The Tangier was very famously the stopping off point for the Prince of Wales on his journeys between London and Brighton in the days of the Regency. But that burnt down in the late 19th century, leaving only the Red Lion. And that used to stand opposite Tadworth Court near the Kingswood roundabout. And although the Red Lion itself is long gone, you can still see the entranceway to it. About 300 yards before you come up to the roundabout on your left-hand side, there's a path protected by bollards that disappears into the woods. And that was the start of a long sweeping carriage drive that led to the coaching inn there. It was owned by the brother-in-law of William Riches, and he worked there as an ostler. So he'd stay overnight looking after the guests' horses. The family stayed down in Epsom for several years, but then moved up to Burheath. It was probably at about that point that the Red Lion passed on into other hands. It was soon demolished after that. The glory days of the coaching trade were starting to disappear by that point. And they lived in a cottage, probably on the green at Burheath, and it was a hard time for them when the Red Lion went, and they were kicked out of their cottage for non-payment of rent, and the children were teased about it at school, prompting a heavily pregnant Sarah Riches to arrive and castigate the headmaster and threaten to withdraw her children from school if any more followed. And about a month after that particular incident, Thomas was born. The family by then had just moved into Oatlands Road at number 9, now number 18. The houses on the northern side of the road are all post-war, and so they weren't there at the time, but the southern side of the road had started to be built in about the 1880s. And so there were something like 16 to 20 houses there by the time they moved in. There were a large family, as many of the families were in Oatlands Road, crammed into quite small houses. You'd often find 10 or 12 people living in a 3-bedroom to 2-bedroom house. Very often just big families because they had lots of children, but also extended families, so uncles and grandparents and whoever lodging with them, sometimes with 3 different family groups inside the same house. Thomas went to school first at the Wesleyan School on the Green. He attended infant school there, but then moved up to the Church of England School, which stood opposite St Mary's, which is now called Chips Folly. And his elder brothers and sisters had gone there before him. When he was coming into the final year of his education, as an older boy at the age of 14, he would have been allowed to go and work part-time, and that he did. And he went to Epsom, presumably, to work for Boots. At the time, there weren't very many brand names in our high street, so it was all independent businesses. And Boots were one of those first big chains that are still around today, the names we would recognise, who were making their presence felt all over the country. They've been founded in the 1870s, incorporated in the 1880s, and in the 1890s, they rapidly expanded throughout the country, taking over lots of independent pharmacists and also building new branches. They had branches in both Epsom and Sutton. The people of Burheath had quite a strong link with Epsom, and so it was presumably the Epsom branch that he worked in, probably as a part-time sales assistant. When war broke out in 1914, neither Edward nor Thomas joined up straight away. Edward was a family man. He had responsibilities to his young daughter and to his wife. And Thomas was very young at the time. He was only 17, far too young to join the army, and probably, although many young men, of course, did lie about their age in the early days, perhaps his family held him back, as his elder brothers had all joined up at the time, and he was the baby of the family still. In 1915, the numbers of men joining the army were dropping off quite severely, and a new recruiting scheme was put forward by Lord Derby, a man from the family who gave their name to the race up on Epsom Downs. He was the Director General of Recruiting, and he put forward this scheme in late 1915 where a canvasser would visit your home and ask you if you were willing to join up in the army or not, and take your details. And then if you said yes, he'd take you off down to the recruiting office and you'd sign up there. And you could choose whether you went into the army straight away or if you deferred your service until you were called up with the other men of your age group. So most of our local men, or a lot of our local men who enlisted under that scheme, chose to defer their service to a later date. That seems to have been what Edward Beadle did. At the time Thomas joined the army in December 1915 under the same scheme, he was still too young. He was still a couple of weeks shy of his 18th birthday at that point. So neither of them joined the army or went into the army for their training until 1916. So sometime in the spring or the summer of 1916, Edward Beadle went in with all the other married men, probably in June, and Thomas took advantage of a scheme that the army offered to train up 18-year-olds, give them special training until they were old enough to go and serve overseas at the age of 19. So he joined the army sometime around June, July as well. One of the great advantages of the Derby scheme, or apparent advantages of the Derby scheme, was that conscription was looming and you would have no choice under conscription of where you served or what you did. And the Derby scheme offered a slightly illusory opportunity to persuade you to join up. So the men would put their names down for their local regiment. In Thomas's case, it was the East Surrey, or maybe a regiment with which their family had a tie. So Edward, for example, put his name down for the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, perhaps with a Welsh ancestry connection there. But those men very often didn't end up serving with those units. They'd be trained with them. But the casualty rate on the Somme was so high that large batches of reinforcements were being sent wherever they were needed. And so they often ended up in a completely different regiment. The other thing that was changing the way the British Army allocated men to regiments, sort of corroding regimental identity to some extent, was the establishment of a training reserve. So with the vast numbers of men coming into the army through conscription and all piling up waiting for training, many regiments couldn't cope with it. So the army decided they were going to centralise all the reserves. So they withdrew the reserve battalions from their regiments and consolidated them into new training reserve brigades. And at that point, many men were moved around. So Edward would have joined up with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, but soon found himself training instead with the South Wales Borderers. Thomas had joined up with the East Surrey Regiment. One of his brothers was also there. But when he completed his training, he found that he was posted to the 7th Border Regiment, a completely different, unrelated entity. At least the Welsh Regiment's training reserves were together in the same training brigade, and Edward would have known sometime in advance of his departure for France that he was going to be serving with another unit. Whereas for Thomas, it might have come as a complete surprise. He had arrived in France expecting to be with the East Surreys, probably just a few weeks after his 19th birthday, and ended up with a regiment from the border between England and Scotland instead. The winter of 1916-17 was hard and it was cold. It was very difficult to dig the ground. When thaw came, so did the rain and the snow, and the ground became churned up and muddy, and it was impossible for a long time to make any kind of progress. The Germans had withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line, a new line of defences, which was a stronger position for them. Their positions on the Somme had become untenable. They were very vulnerable. And so they moved back to this stronger set of defences. So we had an even tougher nut to crack now. While the winter weather was preventing us from launching any new major attacks, That gave us plenty of time to prepare for when the weather would eventually turn for the better. New tactics were devised, new formations, and the men spent a lot of time out of the line training and practicing, advancing in these new intricate formations of diamonds, where you would advance with a section of men would advance with rifles and bayonets. Advancing on one side of them would come the grenadiers with their grenades as well as fixed bayonets, and on the other side of them would come the rifle grenadiers. They'd have rifles with a sort of cup on the end which the grenade sat in, and they'd fire them a long way. They were called the howitzer of the infantry. And then far behind them would come the Lewis gunners, who would provide covering fire for their advance. And once they got near the enemy, they would then deploy into this wave, into one of 3 different wave formations. And again, every man had an assigned place in this. It was quite complex for the men, whereas before they might have just lined up across no man's land and advanced slowly into the German machine guns, that sort of cliche that we think of the Somme. So this was a much more sophisticated way of deploying the army into battle, and it took a lot of rehearsal. They also spent a lot of time practicing advancing behind the creeping barrage. The artillery would have a very precise timetable schedule where they would advance maybe 100 yards every few minutes or so, and the men would learn to stay as close to that barrage as possible. One of the big problems when they originally tried this was that as the barrels of the guns got hot, it affected the flight of the shell, and they weren't consistent, and they'd often drop short and they'd hit the British soldiers advancing behind what should have been the protection of the barrage. So they carefully calibrated the barrel of each of the guns that was going to be used in the coming offensive, and they would make adjustments as they went. And on the whole, there was a very effective system, and the men spent so much time training with that, they gained a great deal of confidence in their gunners. A new offensive had been planned during the winter to break out around the town of Arras in northern France. It sort of sits in a sort of saucer with high ground around it. To the left, high above the village, was the Vimy Ridge. In front of them, a number of spurs and ridges that ran between and beside the Kerguel and Scarpe rivers. And then off to the right was the Hindenburg line along a ridge of hills. It was going to be a 3-pronged attack, this new offensive at Arras. So on the left, the Canadians and British would attack Vimy Ridge. In the middle, 3rd Army were going to attack along the River Scarpe. And on the right, 5th Army were going to attack the Hindenburg line head-on. When the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg line, it did change a lot of the overall strategic plans, but that particular attack around Arras required very little modification. The only thing that changed was that it became a diversionary attack then, and the French were going to launch a huge offensive along the River Aisne, which they hoped would smash through the Germans and potentially end the war. It was the brainchild of a very, very confident and very ambitious, and also, to that point, very successful French General Nivelle, and he'd taken over command of the French army. Unfortunately, he was overly optimistic. His plan that when that attack came from the French would eventually break the French army. They would several battalions would actually mutiny at that point, and they were no longer an effective fighting force for the rest of the war, or attacking force for the rest of the war. But that diversionary attack, we didn't know that at the time. That diversionary attack took place, and it began on the 9th of April. Vimy Ridge was famously captured on that day. Advancing along the Scarpe, 3rd Army took the first 2 lines of objectives. They came up against this line of defences, the Monchy-le-Preux switch line that ran between the village Firchy and Wancourt in the south. They couldn't get through. They lost the barrage. The barrage crept on ahead of them. They were slightly delayed behind it. And by the time that they reached their objective, the Germans already come back into their trenches and stopped them. So there followed several days of very hard fighting to clear that line and then advance into the village behind it. We commemorated one of the men that captured that village behind it, Monchy-le-Preux, George Tickner, on the 11th of April this year. Now, Monchy sits on top of a ridge. It's the highest point on that particular ridge. On the left, the ground slopes down to the River Scarpe, and on the right, it slopes down to the River Kerguel. And it's in front of the village, heading east. The ground just dips down a little bit, and then up again on top of a hill called Infantry Hill, and then a long taper down into the distance towards where the Scarpe and Cudgel rivers nearly meet. We needed to break out of Monchy. Several attempts had been made, but because the Germans still held the far banks of the rivers either side of the hills, they were able to enfilade, they were able to shoot from the side with machine guns at our men as they advanced over open ground, which had very little cover. Those attacks were not very successful. On 13th of April, one of those attacks, we commemorated Alan Guest, one of 3 men to die that day. His battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, suffered that fate, being enfiladed by machine gun fire as they tried to break out of Monchy. We were going to try again. This time it was going to be a much more coordinated attack along a 9-mile front, the centre of which was Monchy. It was quite limited in scope compared to the very ambitious plans that we'd had for Arras and for the Somme originally. And so this time they were just going to target about 2,000 yards of ground. The shortest distance of that advance was only about 1,000 yards, because Monchy sort of stuck out from the line a little bit like a triangle, a salient. So those advancing from the eastern end of the village would only have to go 1,000 yards, and those advancing where the line curved back around the village, they would have to advance maybe 1,500, even 2,000 yards. So where the line curved back around the village and further away was Thomas Rich's that day. He was with the 7th Border Regiment. The British front line, where he was, ran along the top of a ridge, and in front of them was a valley which sloped diagonally down to the River Scarpe, and inside that valley was a small copse called Lone Copse, probably obliterated to matchsticks by that point and just a name on a map. But that was Lone Copse Valley. There were no Germans in there, and so they were able to safely dig assembly trenches in there for their attack ahead of the British line. The Germans were then further on, and they were in a trench which was called Bayonet Trench. And behind Bayonet Trench was a diagonal trench running diagonally off called Rifle Trench, a switch line which then linked into the next set of German defences. And that second set of German defences was the 7th Border Regiment's objective that day. But before they reached that, they'd have to take Bayonet Trench. At 4:45 in the morning on the 23rd of April, a static barrage was put down on Bayonet Trench and all along the first line of German objectives. The men had already crept out of their trench a few minutes in advance of that, and some of them were lying out in no man's land waiting to advance. And as soon as the barrage came down, they got up and they moved towards the Germans. There were still machine gunners in Bayonet Trench and Rifle Trench behind it, and they were able to fire at the men. And so the men on the right of the advance were diverted. Most men, as we all would, if there was a machine gun directly in front of you firing at you, you would go the other way to try and get round it. Even if that was only an illusion of safety, because somewhere further along there would be more machine gunners, unfortunately. But they were pushed right, and instead of going in a straight line, they sort of curved around, and they eventually crossed Bayonet Trench and got into a strong point there. But they suffered very heavy casualties as they did, and most of the men there just found whatever shelter they could from the machine gunners that were still there and the German artillery, which was by now firing. And they actually spent most of the day in cover in shell holes and could not advance any further. On the left of the 7th Border Regiment were the 8th South Staffordshires. And the 8th South Staffordshires and the left of the Border Regiment advanced together towards Bayonet Trench. And they came under extremely heavy machine gun fire from the far banks of the River Scarpe on their left. And the men were mown down. They retired back to the assembly trenches near Lone Copse. And then they saw some of the Germans in Bayonet Trench putting their hands up to surrender. The men gained heart from this, and they rushed out of their trenches across no man's land to attack. As they did so, the machine gunners across the river opened up once more, and once more the men were mown down, and they retired to their assembly trenches. The commander of the 8th South Staffordshires reorganised his men again into a new formation, and again they tried. The battle had only been raging for about 40 minutes by now, and they had already carried out 3 assaults. Each of those 3 was met by stiff machine gun fire. Each of those 3 suffered very heavy casualties. And once more, they retired to the assembly trenches. The Border Regiment would not go forward again. A few men of the South Staffordshires were ordered forward in the evening, and exactly the same thing happened again. Off to the right of Thomas Rich's that day was Edward Beadle with the South Wales Borderers. They were in front of Monchy. They had the smallest advance to make that day. Their line ran along the edge of a wood which grew into the village. And in front of them were a number of small copses on the side of Infantry Hill, which sort of sloped up on their right. They were to advance through these copses, through 2 lines of German trenches, and then beyond to the woods of the Bois du Sart. And that was the final objective for the advance that day. Their first objective was about 500 yards, very little cover till they get there. But they had the static barrage on the German lines, the same as Thomas had to protect him to the north. But as they advanced, the British shells fell short and they hit the borderers. But they carried on. And they shot their way through Arrow Head Copse and the twin copses. They captured the trenches that they needed to capture. But their assault came to an end at the twin copse, many hundreds of yards short of their final objective that day. The attacks on their right had failed, and the attacks on their left had failed. And the failure of Thomas's brigade to push up on their left meant that their left flank was very, very badly exposed. And snipers and machine gunners were moving around to their left and inflicting very heavy casualties. So they had to redistribute themselves, and reinforcements were pushed to the left flank, and they were left with no choice but to just consolidate a defensive position. Thomas Riches and Edward Beadle were both killed in the attacks that day. Thomas was 19 and Edward was 32. He left a widow and a young child. I'd like to ask if we have any relatives of either of the men here today, or if we have anyone else with any connection to either of them that would like to volunteer to toll the bell 100 times in their honour. Go on.
Well, my son and daughter-in-law used to live in the house that Thomas Riches lived in at 18 Oatlands Road.
Fantastic.
So I thought I would come.
Well volunteered. So in a moment, if you'd like to stand, and we will toll.